Episode 66. Past Events. Upon hearing their conversation, old Mrs. Horton asked curiously,
"Which Allen family?"
Tom instinctively glanced at Lewis, not daring to respond. Lewis, however, explained,
"The Allen family from Clarence."
The moment these words escaped his lips, a semblance of shock washed over old Mrs. Horton's face. Keira, who was acutely perceptive, sensed that the atmosphere in the room had become slightly tense. Her doe-like eyes subtly surveyed Lewis before discreetly observing Tom. Tom discreetly signaled her to avoid speaking recklessly. At this moment, the nurse came in with breakfast. Keira assisted old Mrs. Horton towards the table where the food had been arranged. The three of them usually refrained from talking while they were dining. However, today, after old Mrs. Horton finished half her bowl of milk, she set her spoon down.
"Brat, isn't it better for you not to work with the Allen family?"
Keira glanced at Lewis. The man lowered his gaze. His long eyelashes veiled his thoughts, making them inscrutable. Seeing this, Tom immediately suggested,
"If it's right, shall we go and ask the doctor about old Mrs. Horton's health status?"
Keira deduced from these words that Tom was trying to clear the room. The rest of the conversation, she surmised, wasn't meant for them to hear. She picked up the half-eaten sandwich and was about to leave the room with Tom when old Mrs. Horton grabbed her arm.
"My dear, you don't need to leave. You're one of us, not an outsider. Sooner or later, you'll know about the mess in this family."
Tom instinctively looked toward Lewis. Lewis knitted his brows, looking slightly displeased. He opened his mouth, but eventually said nothing. Tom left the room quietly, closing the door behind him. He stood guard outside to prevent anyone from barging in and to avert any eavesdropping. Seeing this, Keira understood that she was about to learn some of the Horton family's secrets. She felt awkward, not knowing whether to stay or to leave. After all, she wasn't Lewis's real wife or lover. Was it appropriate for her to listen to their conversation? Just as she was caught in this dilemma, old Mrs. Horton began addressing her.
"My dear, I've never spoken to you about my spoiled brat's mother, have I?"
Keira cautiously glanced at Lewis and noticed that he was casually eating his bread without any intention of interrupting their conversation. She went ahead and asked,
"Was Mr. Horton's mother related to the Allen family?"
Old Mrs. Horton let out a sigh without really noticing their subtle interaction and confessed,
"She has no connection with the Allen family, but with Mrs. Allen. In fact, the brat's mother is Mrs. Allen's sister."
She went on about the past.
"Years ago, we wanted to establish a marital alliance with the Davis family from Clarence. My unsuccessful son had divorced once in his youth. When he was just over 40, he married a girl in her 20s from the Davis family. After she became pregnant, we discovered that his ex-wife had secretly raised a son, Lewis's older brother."
Keira was mentally sorting these relationships. That Miss Davis would have been Lewis's mother. Her father-in-law, Nathan Horton, had a son with his ex-wife. That child was Lewis's older brother, Oliver Horton, who was also Jake Horton's father. Oliver and Lewis were half-brothers. No wonder they were at odds. Old Mrs. Horton continued,
"Marrying a man nearly twice her age was hardly an attractive prospect for the young Miss Davis. It was solely a business alliance. She was fairly reluctant, and upon discovering the deceit, she was furious. She was a hot-tempered woman, and chose a C-section while she was 7 months pregnant. After giving birth to the brat, she sought a drastic divorce and went back to the Davises. Rightfully so, the Davis family grew to resent the Horton family, and all communications between the two families were severed.
Old Mrs. Horton looked somewhat distressed after recounting this. Keira pursed her lips, looking toward Louis. Whether Louis's father, Nathan Horton, knew about the existence of his son, and whether he had truly deceived Louis's mother, had now become a topic of irrelevance. Regardless, there was no arguing that Miss Davis had every right to demand a divorce. But how could she be so heartless as to abandon her child, born prematurely at 7 months, with the Horton family? Couldn't she have waited till after the divorce to have the child? Or waited just 2 more months until he was fully ready for birthing? He was already a 7-month fetus. He was alive. She recollected something old Mrs. Horton had once mentioned, that Louis, as a newborn, was only around 1.5 pounds. He had been placed in a neonatal intensive care unit for 3 months, with tubes fitted across his body. His condition had been so severe that several times he had nearly failed to survive, which was why the old lady ended up nicknaming him Puppy. So that was how it happened. She was reminded of what Louis had said to comfort her.
Some people don't deserve to be mothers. You can simply treat them as strangers.
Keira drew a deep breath. She felt her chest tighten. The truth was, Louis was just like her. He was also abandoned by his biological mother. She looked at Louis, who was drinking milk with his head lowered. His handsome features looked as tough as iron, making him seem distant. That aloof demeanor seemed to carry a sense of brokenness. Keira felt a tug at her heartstrings. She felt a sudden urge to hold him. Old Mrs. Horton sighed, knitting her brows.
I heard that Mrs. Allen and the brat's biological mother were extremely close sisters. This led to the Allen family's disapproval of the Horton family all these years. Everyone had perspectives of their own, and none was right or wrong. If this is going to strain your relationship, is it necessary to force this partnership?
Louis put down his glass of milk, gracefully wiped his mouth with a napkin, and finally looked up.
We're all adults, and business always boils down to interests. We don't bring up past grudges.
He got up.
Grandma, don't worry. I won't let myself be wronged.
Keira followed behind Louis as they walked from the hospital ward toward the rehabilitation department. However, they were stopped at the entrance of the rehab department. Frankie's secretary apologized with a grim expression.
Mr. Horton, Miss Allen isn't in good condition. It's not convenient for her to entertain visitors.
Upon hearing this, Tom lashed out furiously.
It's an honor for Allen family that our Mr. Horton has designed to visit. They dare to drive us away?
The secretary quickly clarified.
No offense, she really isn't doing well.
Before Tom could retort, Louis intervened.
Let's go.
The trio began heading back the way they came. En route, Tom was infuriated.
That's an outrage. Do they really think we are afraid of them? We're simply trying to avoid causing trouble.
The day before, Jake paid a visit to the patient, but they were stopped today. Should this leak, wouldn't it make their boss look weak? Louis, however, calmly remarked,
Frankie Allen isn't one to be arrogant. His sister must be truly unwell.
Only then did Tom stop complaining. Louis was due at the company. Therefore, he parted ways with Tom at the parking area. Keira let out a sigh, preparing to return to old Mrs. Horton's ward. Just then, her phone beeped. It was a message from Rebecca's brother.
Miss Olsen, could you please come by the hospital?
Rebecca's not doing well, and she insists on seeing you.
Keira looked puzzled. Rebecca's brother? His name was Frankie Allen, wasn't it? Episode 67. Misjudgment. Keira gazed at the text message, offering a dry smile. She had always had a good memory. That day when she called Rebecca's brother, he introduced himself as Frankie Allen. She hadn't paid much attention then. Now, putting all the coincidences together, she could confirm that Mr. Allen, who worked with Horton Group, had a sister named Rebecca Allen. What a coincidence! She replied to the message.
All right, on my way now.
The atmosphere in Rebecca's hospital room was tense at this moment. Frankie Allen held his mobile phone and saw the reply from the other party. Only then did he turn his head toward his sister, who was still lying on the hospital bed without moving a muscle. Her little face was pale, and she was curled up on the bed. Mr. Allen and Mrs. Allen were anxiously pacing around the room.
Rebecca, how will you get better if you refuse to cooperate in therapy? Please accept the treatment, will you?
Rebecca, however, was stubborn.
Unless you allow me to see Miss Dawson, I won't undergo any treatment.
Frankie frowned. He knew that his sister had been overly protected since childhood, which resulted in her becoming headstrong. Otherwise, she wouldn't have eloped with her boyfriend back then. A pure-hearted person like his sister would be safe her whole life if she was surrounded by good friends. But if surrounded by bad people, like her ex-husband, the consequences would be unimaginable. Therefore, Frankie would forcefully interfere with her friendships and wouldn't let her meet Miss Olsen again. Mr. Allen, being a doting father, looked directly at Frankie.
Did you call Miss Olsen?
Frankie had just been forced to reply to his sister's message. Fuming, he responded to his father.
Yes, I called her.
Mr. Allen then hurriedly inquired.
Will she come?
Rebecca also looked at him with anticipation. Frankie took a deep breath.
With an opportunity to grant favors like this, how could she possibly not come? She says she'll arrive soon.
Rebecca's eyes twinkled upon hearing his words. Mr. Allen also heaved a sigh of relief. Seeing that his son wasn't pleased, he took the initiative to scold Rebecca.
Rebecca, you really are stubborn this time. Your brother is never wrong in judging people. After all, we all want what's best for you.
Mrs. Allen also chimed in.
Rebecca, you indeed went too far. Our family's relationship with the Horton family is complicated. If it weren't for the fact that we were exclusively working with the Horton family on this project, I would have never wanted to associate ourselves with them again. The Horton family has humiliated your aunt in the past. Our relationship with them has always been complicated, especially with the main branch, which is at odds with Louis Horton.
She took a deep breath.
Even if the relationship is terrible, Louis is still your aunt's biological son. Now, we are helping the main branch of the Hortons to repay this favor. It simply doesn't make sense. Don't blame your brother for being careless. Miss Olsen is invited to accompany you. All these are favors that he has to repay.
But Rebecca looked at them.
Miss Olsen isn't that kind of person. As my brother said, she simply introduced her fiancé to my brother. Maybe that was all to it.
Her parents and brother couldn't understand the feeling she had. She was saved on the brink of death, and Miss Olsen was like a savior. She had suffered the betrayal of her husband and was going through the stages of confusion, shock, and fear. Although her parents were there to accompany her, they were elders, and there would naturally be a gap in their thinking. Moreover, Rebecca had her own pride. She didn't want her parents to see her weakness because it reminded her of how errant her decision was back then. She also had the desire to confide, to find someone she thought she could rely on to pour out the pain in her heart. The person she trusted the most at the moment was Miss Olsen. Listening to her naive words, Frankie scowled.
In business, people don't express their intentions directly. Having interacted with so many people, it's clear to me what her intentions were. That blatant scheming expression on her face was downright tacky.
At that time, Isla almost had her intentions pasted on her face. Rebecca became agitated.
You must have misunderstood. Miss Dawson isn't that kind of person. Brother, I don't want to hear your bad mouth my savior anymore.
Mr. Allen quickly added,
Alright, your brother was just warning you. Jay did invite her over, did he?
Mrs. Allen also didn't say anything more. After all, their daughter's health was the most important. Frankie had been forced by his parents to send the message. At this moment, he felt nothing but anger. He turned and walked out of the room. Mrs. Allen asked,
Where are you going?
Work.
Frankie walked straight out of the door. If he stayed any longer, he was afraid his recalcitrant sister might enrage him to death. Moreover, he had just prevented Lewis Horton from visiting the room. He had to go explain to Lewis Horton himself. Lewis wasn't someone easy to deal with. The collaboration with Horton Group was beneficial to both parties, and Frankie merely proposed Jake to see this project, so the request wasn't outrageous, and Lewis Horton was willing to comply. However, Frankie wouldn't dare to be excessive, and Lewis Horton wouldn't allow it either. Although the two might not have a cordial relationship because of their elders, when it came to project collaboration, they had a mutual understanding. With a gloomy face, Frankie strode to the elevator. As the elevator door opened, a stunning woman came out. Even though Frankie wasn't in a good mood, he couldn't help but glance at her. Upon looking at her, he paused a little. This woman looked somewhat familiar. On the night when Miss Olson saved Rebecca, her hair was disheveled and covered her face, so Frankie didn't get a good look at her. He only had a vague impression of her. When Isla claimed to be that person, he unwittingly merged the vague image in his mind with her. Therefore, upon seeing Keira, apart from feeling familiar, he had no other thoughts. He brushed past Keira, stepped into the elevator, and headed for the ground floor. Keira did glance at him but didn't say anything. Thinking of him siding with Jake inside the Horton Group, she found it quite annoying. Keira entered the ward. After seeing her, Rebecca's mood improved greatly. After chatting with Keira briefly, she agreed to undergo rehabilitation training. Mr. Allen and Mrs. Allen looked at her from the side and quietly discussed among themselves.
Miss Olsen's eyes are clear. She doesn't look like those flatters, right?
I also think so. Does Frankie has issues judging people?
No way. Our son has been accurate all these years. Or maybe she's too good at hiding.
Keira then received a call, and the person on the other end mentioned that they were from the police station. They stated that Rebecca's husband and mother-in-law were part of a murder case, so they needed to double-check the statement. They wanted her to go to the police station to give a more detailed statement. Keira said,
No problem. I'll be on my way.
Meanwhile, not long after leaving the hospital, Frankie received a call from the police station.
Mr. Allen, we need you to handle some formalities for your sister's case. Do you have time to come over now?
Frankie answered with an icy voice.
I'm on my way.
Episode 68. Meeting. Isla also received a call from the police station. As a witness who saw the whole incident, when she discovered that Rebecca's brother was no ordinary person, she cooperated with the police to provide her statement and didn't dare to lie. She was more than happy to oblige, so she happily agreed. By testifying for Rebecca, she could make Frankie indebted to her again. Just as she was feeling triumphant, her phone suddenly rang again. She glanced at the caller ID, her face darkened. It was Finley Hill. While she wanted to hang up, she didn't dare to. Finally, she reluctantly picked up.
What?
Dear niece, you have to help me. If I can't pay back the money this time, I will be beaten to death.
Finley Hill's voice made Isla frown and irritated. She clenched her fist.
How much?
5 million.
How much?
Isla's voice suddenly rose, feeling like she must have heard him wrong. Although the Olsen family was wealthy and gave her an allowance of $150,000 every month since middle school, Olsen's current cash deposit was only a few million. Along with the company's working capital, it didn't even reach 20 million. She thought that the 2 million from last time would keep Finley Hill occupied for a while, but it had only been a few days, and Finley Hill needed 5 million more. However, Finley Hill wasn't at all intimidated.
Can you afford it or not? If you can't, they will kill me. Then I will have to talk to Keira.
Isla's pupils contracted.
You have 2 days. If the money isn't in my account by then, don't blame me for revealing your and Keira's origins. After all, one's life is the most important, right?
After leaving these words, Finley Hill hung up. The infuriated Isla threw her cell phone to the ground. She took a deep breath. To come up with such a large sum of 5 million, she could only ask her family for help. Thinking of this, Isla began to hesitate and falter. Although Keira didn't expose her for stealing Dr. South's emails, Mrs. Olsen seemed to have guessed something. Starting from yesterday, she wasn't in a good mood toward Isla. Isla frowned and went to Mrs. Olsen's room. As she got close, she heard Mrs. Olsen asking,
Where is Poppy Hill? She seemed to be disappeared for a few days.
Taylor answered,
Who cares what she's doing? Maybe she went back to her brother's place. She'd better not come back at all. I get annoyed every time I see her.
Outside, Isla's eyes flickered. She collected her emotions, walked in with red eyes, and choked out,
Mom! Dad!
Mrs. Olsen got up to comfort her but hesitated and sat back down on the sofa. Taylor frowned and asked,
Isla, did you upset your mother?
Isla began to cry.
Mom! I was wrong! I shouldn't have framed Keira! I was just jealous of the attention you gave her!
Her tears seemed genuine.
Mom, Keira is so capable now. She's Dr. South and can arrange hospital rooms for you. But I am not as good as her. I'm a bit scared that your love for her will suppress your love for me. When I was studying with her, classmates teased me, saying that my parents were getting a divorce and you were buying clothes and food for her. They also said that you didn't want me anymore and wanted her as a daughter. That's why I was always more concerned about her.
Mrs. Olsen's expression softened visibly. She stepped toward Isla and sighed.
How can you be so narrow-minded? Moreover, Keira kept her distance because she was aware of this. She hasn't come home in years. She's not trying to take me away from you, and I won't love her more than you either. Stop thinking too much from now on.
Isla sobbed.
Really?
Mrs. Olsen chuckled.
You're all grown up. How can I lie to you?
Isla chuckled through her tears.
Then tell me you love me the most.
Mrs. Olsen said in resignation.
Okay, I love you the most.
Isla's smile grew more genuine, but then she heard Mrs. Olsen mention something else.
You should stop seeing Keira as your imagined enemy.
Her smile faltered and a shadow crossed her eyes. Isla lowered her head.
I won't anymore. I'm sorry for what I did.
After placating Mrs. Olsen, Isla finally spoke up.
Mom, I'm going to buy a wedding ring with Jake today. I thought I should buy a gift for him as well.
Mrs. Olsen nodded in approval.
Good. We shouldn't take advantage of him.
Isla, who had a job now, had a monthly living expense of $300,000. She lived at home and didn't usually spend too much money. Mrs. Olsen assumed that Isla would have accumulated millions in her private coffers, and hence didn't perceive any subtext in Isla's words. Isla's expression froze momentarily. She gritted her teeth and decided to be candid.
After I got together with Jake, my expenses have increased somewhat. I'm a bit short of cash now.
Only then did Mrs. Olsen understand.
I still have over 300,000 here. I will transfer it to you later.
Isla choked on her words.
Only over 300,000?
Mrs. Olsen sighed.
Yes. I lent my money to Keira. She wanted to buy some stocks.
Before Isla could express her dissatisfaction, Taylor got in first.
Buying stocks? The stock market is doing so badly now. Who would join that this time? It's utter nonsense. What if we lose that money?
But Mrs. Olsen waved him off.
She said a friend gave her a tip, so we won't lose money. Besides, even if we lose money, just consider it as a gift for her. Over the years, she has brought billions of profits to the company. Giving her over 10 million isn't enough to thank her.
Taylor frowned, clearly not satisfied. But Isla felt a surge of anxiety, realizing that she couldn't get her hands on 5 million in a short time. She walked downstairs in a daze and got in Jake Horton's car. Jake seemed rather lively.
Isla, my father was very happy to hear that you saved Mr. Allen's sister. He transferred some money this morning and asked me to buy some nice jewelry for you as a gift from him.
Isla's eyes flickered with guilt.
Let's go to the police station first. They need me to make a record for Mr. Allen's sister's case.
Jake smiled.
Sure, I'll drop you off.
When they arrived, they ran into Frankie Allen in the parking lot. Seeing Isla, Frankie understood why she was there. Thinking of her coming here to testify, his resentment toward her lessened.
Miss Olsen, thank you for making this trip.
Isla smiled.
No problem.
The three of them exchanged greetings and were about to enter the police station when they ran into Keira, who was coming out. Keira was the first to arrive at the police station. She recounted again the events of that day from start to end, confirmed that the statement was accurate, and signed and sealed the statement. She then headed out. The police officer who saw her out was still speaking to her.
Miss Olsen, you decided on the spot to save someone. We've decided to commend you orally. We are preparing to issue a public announcement.
Episode 69. Demand. When she heard that an announcement was to be made, Keira hastily said,
There's no need for such an announcement.
Yes, there is.
The officer replied with a smile. Keira resignedly said,
All right.
When they reached the entrance, they bumped into Frankie and Isla. They were registering. Once the officer in charge of reception saw the two next to Keira, he called out,
We need to promote good deeds and those who perform them so that others can be inspired. That's our public relations department's job.
Frankie and Isla turned around when they heard his words. Isla's pupils contracted slightly when she saw Keira. Frankie had perceived something. His eyebrows knitted together in thought. This woman was also here for his sister's case? Keira scanned them with a quick glance, then looked away. Feeling no inclination to get involved with these people, she proceeded to exit the building.
Officer Cohen, these two are about Rebecca Allen's murder case too. You might as well take them in. Please, wait a moment. I will take you in as soon as I escort this young lady out.
Officer Cohen said. Frankie nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. He looked toward Isla and asked,
Was that young lady also present when what happened to my sister occurred?
Jake also looked at Isla. He knew about how Isla and Frankie became acquainted, but if Keira had also saved Rebecca Allen, how was he going to win over Frankie? Isla's eyes cooled a fraction, and she gave a bitter, rueful smile.
Mr. Allen, that's my sister. We were indeed together at the time. It was actually her who Rebecca first asked for help. But Kira's always rather aloof. Oh, she didn't mean to turn Rebecca away. Jake, you know about her personality.
Jake frowned.
She is indeed cold-hearted and aloof. She doesn't enjoy socializing with others.
Isla sighed.
She stopped me from calling you, saying that those who are lost in love all deserve to die.
As she said that, she seemed to realize what she had implied and quickly covered her mouth.
Oh, don't be angry, Mr. Allen. I don't think Rebecca took it to heart.
Frankie's face had already become as dark as storm clouds. He thought of when Rebecca came to after her surgery after he had rescued her. The first words she had spoken were,
Brother, do people as foolish as me deserve to live?
At the time, he had thought it was because she was lovesick, but it was actually because of someone else's insults. Jake couldn't help but frown.
She's indeed sensible. Despite having so many pursuers in university, she never agreed to date anyone. I suppose such a person might never develop feelings for anyone else in her lifetime. Maybe in her eyes, love is synonymous with foolishness.
He clenched his fists. Had she seen him in this way in the past too? He suddenly felt a tightness in his chest. He looked at Isla.
You two go ahead with deposition. I'll wait for you outside.
After he left them with these words, he rushed out the door. Frankie's gaze fell on Jake, deep in thought. Meanwhile, Isla casually asked,
When do you plan to return to clans, Mr. Allen? How's your sister doing? I'm sure that the hospitals there are better than here in Oceania.
Frankie averted his gaze.
Yes, we'll be signing the contracts today, and I'm planning to take Rebecca back to clans for her recovery the day after tomorrow. We don't wish to impose on you, Miss Olsen.
Given Keira's determined nature, Frankie would feel safer if Rebecca were further away from her. Isla breathed a sigh of relief. She feared that if Frankie stayed in Oceanian for too long, he would discover the truth. It would be best if he left soon. Outside the police station, Keira was standing by the roadside, waiting for her ride. As she stood there, a shadow fell beside her, and Jake's voice drifted into her ears.
Keira, I never would have guessed that you were Dr. South. But don't you realize that without strong financial backing, launching a business is no easy task?
Keira's expression was aloof and cold as she glanced at him but said nothing. Jake felt like he was being suffocated. He remembers when she had this indifferent attitude toward everyone but him in university. He never imagined that one day her coldness would be targeted at him. Exasperated, he burst out,
In the commercial world, connections often matter more than actual capability. Keira, you're so cold. You're always so indifferent towards others. You deserve to lose this great opportunity.
Keira tilted her head, puzzled. What chance had she missed? At that moment, her ride arrived. She ignored Jake's rambling, got into the car, and drove off. Watching her leave, Jake knew he had completely lost her. But he had no regrets. Even after realizing she was Dr. South, he had no regrets. He could never marry an illegitimate daughter. Only after he had spent a lot of time convincing himself did he finally calm down. As Isla and Frankie completed their deposition and left the police station, Jake promptly went over to welcome them. Frankie said,
Apologies for delaying Miss Olsen and Mr. Horton's date.
Isla laughed.
Oh, don't be so formal. It was my responsibility after all. Well, Mr. Allen, where are you off to now?
Frankie looked at the time.
I have an agreement to sign with Mr. Horton today. After signing the contract, the cooperation between the two companies will be established.
Upon hearing this, Jake immediately chimed in.
It's a pity that I'm not a higher position. Otherwise, I would have been the one signing the agreement with Mr. Allen today.
Frankie's gaze froze, and then he heard Isla's words.
Jake, have you not been promoted yet? If you're the vice director, It would indeed be inconvenient to negotiate cooperation with Mr. Allen.
Jake replied.
My uncle said he would promote me after we signed the contract, but he's been so busy lately, and I'm afraid he might forget.
Isla then looked at Frankie.
Mr. Allen, could you remind Mr. Horton when you signed the contract?
Frankie stopped to think. He was a seasoned businessman. How could he not understand the hidden meaning behind her words? But he hadn't expected that Jake wouldn't even have the patience to climb the corporate ladder slowly and steadily. Jake was trampling on Frankie's goodwill in a rush to get to the top. Frankie took a deep breath and looked at Isla.
All right.
After parting ways with the two, Frankie went to the Horton Group. The signing ceremony was a significant event for both companies and was conducted in a very formal manner. In the enormous conference room, the two of them sat across from each other at the conference table. When Louis completed the paperwork, he handed the documents to Frankie, only to realize that Frankie hadn't signed his part of the agreement. Louis narrowed his eyes, a chill emanating from him.
Mr. Allen, do you have any doubts about the contract? There is no issue with the contract,
Frankie said calmly.
That it was agreed that young Mr. Horton will be in charge of this project, yet his position still appears to be that of a vice president.
Louis's face hardened.
Mr. Allen, are you trying to interfere with the Horton Group's appointment? No, of course not. I simply find young Mr. Horton to be quite agreeable, and I believe Mr. Horton will grant me this favor.
Frankie put up an appearance suggesting he wouldn't sign the contract without an agreeable response. Episode 70. It's her. Tom was on the verge of exploding with anger. Jake had done nothing, and yet he was appointed as the director? Based on what? But he understood that at this crucial stage of cooperation, such a request for the Horton Group was just a small matter. With so many executives watching, such a minor job transfer would inevitably be agreed to by Louis. How frustrating. What was wrong with this Frankie Allen? Even if the Davis family harbored resentment against the Horton family back then, shouldn't it be aimed at the first branch of the family? Why was he always against Louis? Louis's expression was calm. He had always been cool-minded, and his piercing gaze fixed on Frankie Allen. Slowly, he said,
If I don't agree, won't Mr. Allen sign the deal?
His interrogatory statement quieted the room instantly. Louis looked indifferent. There were many people from the Horton Group in the conference room, all of whom could bring pressure on Louis. But there were also plenty of people from the Allen family. If the cooperation was cancelled because of the unreasonable requirement proposed by Frankie Allen, he would face the company's pressure too. Now it was merely a test of each side's patience. The one who couldn't hold out would lose. After a long while, Louis still appeared calm. Frankie Allen was left with no choice but to speak up.
Of course not, Mr. Horton. Maybe you misunderstood. This is just my personal proposal.
The chill around Louis seemed to fade a bit.
Let's sign the contract first. Jake will be responsible for the future cooperation.
Once Jake got things done, there would be a reason for his promotion to director. This was a verbal promise that Louis gave to Frankie Allen. Both sides were large corporate groups. Frankie Allen took a step back, and Louis didn't want to be overly aggressive. Frankie nodded, signed the two contracts, and stamped them. Thus, the cooperation officially took effect. Frankie stood up and extended a hand to Louis.
Mr. Horton, happy working with you.
Louis looked at him indifferently without saying a word, showing that he was still dissatisfied with the commotion that Frankie had recently stirred up. Seeing this, Frankie Allen waved his hand to dismiss the assistants in the conference room. After the room was left with two people, he turned to Louis, trying to explain.
Don't get me wrong. My actions weren't instigated by my aunt. I owed Isla Olsen a favor. I just had to fight for some benefits for Jake.
Upon hearing this, Louis stood up.
No need to explain. I'm not interested in her.
Frankie frowned.
My sister was humiliated in the hospital and almost lost her life. Isla Awesome protected her and called me, saving my sister. I have to repay this debt.
Louis's eyes narrowed, colder than before. Without another word, he walked out the door. Tom followed him.
Boss, we just discussed with the people from the Allen family. There will be celebratory banquet tomorrow night. I inquired just now and Frankie Allen will come. I heard that his parents have also arrived in Oceania and will attend then.
Upon hearing this, Louis narrowed his eyes.
I see.
Frankie Allen's mother was that woman's younger sister, his own aunt. Tom continued.
There's one problem. Your date. Should we find one from the secretariat or should we ask Miss Olsen?
Louis expressed plainly.
He probably doesn't like such events. Forget it.
It meant that he didn't need a date. Tom nodded in acknowledgement, but he was taken aback shortly after. If it were in the past, the boss would have reprimanded him for being too talkative as soon as he heard the name Miss Olsen. Now he was saying that she didn't like the occasion? It seems like the boss's attitude toward Miss Olsen had changed. Keira didn't feel any change. After all, when Louis returned from work, he was still wearing a gloomy face, as if someone owed him a fortune. Even when the puppy raised its head and wagged its tail to greet him, the man didn't even give it a glance. Keira pretended she didn't see it and continued with her work, wrapping up her drug research. These days, she had thoroughly understood the neurology data borrowed from the Horton Group. The problem she encountered in her research now had a solution, so she could now create the clinical drug for Alzheimer's disease soon. Old Mrs. Horton had been very anxious since Keira wasn't going to work anymore. She wanted the couple to foster their relationship more, and initially intended to talk to Louis after work to take his wife out to see a concert or have a meal or something. But looking at his face, she couldn't help but comment,
"He must have had a tough day at work."
She turned to Tom and asked,
"Did he encounter any difficulty?"
When Louis went to wash his hands in the bathroom, Tom couldn't help but say,
It's still then Frankie Allen. I don't know what's wrong with him. He's always against the boss and tries to promote young Mr. Horton.
Keira raised her eyebrows. Had Tom forgotten that old Mrs. Horton was also Jake's great-grandmother? He was talking like this in front of the old lady. But to her surprise, old Mrs. Horton snorted.
"How come I didn't know that there was a relationship between the Allen family and Jake? How did they connect? Doesn't Jake really know that the Allen family has reservations about his uncle? Wait, shouldn't the Allen family hate the first branch?"
Her expression clearly showed that she was unhesitatingly standing on Louis's side. Tom snorted.
Who knows what's going on? It's a shame that Allen family doesn't have a proper relationship with us but is getting all cozy with the first branch.
Old Mrs. Horton pursed her lips.
"Didn't you go to see Allen's younger daughter at the hospital today? Wasn't the relationship reconciled a bit? Seeing her own nephew, didn't Mrs. Allen show any emotions?"
Tom sighed.
We didn't meet them. They said that patient wasn't well.
Old Mrs. Horton was very dissatisfied.
"Even if her condition isn't good, shouldn't they let us see her? Once you think about it, they aren't close to us and haven't tried to make an effort. Actually, some relatives are easy to get along with once the ice is broken."
The old lady had thought it through. After all, it was her son who failed Louis's mother back then, so it was natural for the Davis family to hate them. She resented them previously because Louis's mother had a C-section when she was 7 months pregnant, putting Louis in critical condition several times, which the old lady felt was too ruthless. But now, the Horton family and her grandson weren't close. The old lady was no longer as strong, and if the Davis family could release some goodwill to fill the gap in the feelings of her grandson. So she was actually hoping that through this cooperation, Louis could get closer to the Allen family. But who would have thought that it would turn out like this? Old Mrs. Horton was filled with worry.
What's wrong with the Allen family?
Seeing that she was mumbling to herself, Keira suddenly suggested,
Grandma, why don't I introduce the two families to each other?
After all, she was Rebecca Allen's savior, and felt that Mr. and Mrs. Allen were good people when she met them. Once the relationship thawed, they would be able to get along slowly. Louis, who had just washed his hands, came out of the bathroom and heard this. His gaze grew cold, but he immediately followed up with a question.
Do you know the Allen family?
Keira nodded.
Yes, I did them a small favor earlier.
A small favor. Louis suddenly realized something.
So it was you who saved his sister.
Keira was surprised.
How do you know?